studies that we're having on Wednesday night does not primarily approach each of these books as we go sequentially through the Old Testament from any basic starting point, like we'll look at them prophetically, or we'll look at them biographically, or we'll look at them in terms of a devotional view. We've tried to take each book and unfold it and look at it and get an overview of it in terms of what the book was saying itself. And if it was biographical, as in the case of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel and 1 Kings and 2 Kings, so be it. And in each of our studies of these books, a different book of the Bible each Wednesday night, hopefully you have derived from these studies something to live by and something to put into practice, something to apply to your life. There's nothing more frustrating than studying the Bible in terms of the facts of the text without the reinforcement of your faith. And I hear this every day talking to people. They are striving to find something in their church that brings them meaning and relevance in their lives. As of this afternoon, I was talking to a man, and he was telling me that my pastor, he says, didn't give me the pastor's name. I just bumped into him accidentally after getting some gas. He said, "You're Dr. Rhoads," and we started that way from ground zero. He said, "I don't want to say anything about our church," and I don't know what it was, and I don't want to say anything about our pastor, but he talks about 15 or 18 minutes, and it just seems as if he's getting to something that will kind of help me, and I'm looking for it. And he says, it seems, this is exactly what he did with his two hands, he said, it seems as if it just goes like that. It just doesn't quite get to me, and then the service is over. And you hear that from people. They are somewhat informed about the basic teaching and structure of the Bible and of God and things like that. But in terms of where they're hurting and their personal needs, it seems to go like that. So we hope that through these series on Wednesday nights, you have derived from the series something that has caused your faith to flourish, as well as the information and the facts of these books just to remain with you, to be stored up for a referral later on. Now, saying all of that brings me to a conclusion that I made about the study of the book of Daniel tonight, and that is, I want to take this book tonight for you, unlike I did any other book in the Old Testament, and studied it personally, devotionally, practically, from a biographic standpoint. We'll hit a little bit of the history. We'll touch a little bit on the biography of the person Daniel. But mainly, I want you to feel the truth tonight and apply it to your life. All right? Now, you don't have to look at any verse, but you have to listen. And if you're taking notes, you may want to take a couple of statements at this point. Daniel was a Jewish person. The land or the nation of Israel was attacked. And they were attacked and assaulted and defeated and overrun by the nation, the people of Babylon. The Babylonian Empire. Now, the word empire is not a word that we relate to. We used to talk about the British Empire. Well, that was 75 years ago when 80% of the world was controlled by Britain. Now they are exporting less than they're importing, and they're totally bankrupt as a nation. When you speak of the Babylonian Empire, you are speaking of the country of Iran. And so you have this Jewish person by the name of Daniel, who was in what we would call Israel, the land of Israel. And the land was attacked and overrun by what we would call today the Iranians. But it was called Babylon, the Babylonian Empire. All right? This assault, this hostage taking, this defeat by this Babylonian Empire took place when Daniel was 16. And at that assault, hundreds of thousands of Jewish people, of course, were slain. And only a few were left and taken as hostages, we would call them, or as slaves, as the trophies of the conquest. The best of the young men who could be trained, the most potential, were saved and not slain, and physically brought to Babylon. And Daniel, at the age of 16, was one of these captives. From the age 16, add 69 years, this young man at the age of 16, Daniel, lived in Babylon and served as a leader in this most atrocious, violent, and pagan nation. Now, I say that because a couple of weeks ago we did Jeremiah, and Jeremiah was in Israel, and then when the Jewish people were assaulted and taken down to Egypt, he went down to Egypt, and he was a roving prophet that was always with the people. In all of their trial, he was with them to preach to them. Daniel, just the opposite. At a time of destruction, most were destroyed. At the age of 16, he was taken away. Now you have to think this and remember this, because the meaning of the book only is impacted when you visualize what this young man is being taken to. Not only how socially upsetting it would be. We talk about cross-culture evangelism and cultural shock by missionaries and by people who go to another country. Use that kind of thing if you think that way, of being put in another culture without any identification factor in terms of family, religion, language, or whatever. And at the age of 16, that is the cultural transplanting of Daniel. Now, if that happened to you tonight, if you were taken from Charlotte and put into another culture, the question I've been asking myself all week is, how would you react? Not only psychologically, but spiritually. When you are removed from your spiritual arena, from the factors that make you a strong Christian and keep you perking along, how does your spiritual life fare? When you go on a vacation, for instance, do you backslide? Do you slip away? Do you avoid finding a good Bible-preaching church? Do you forget to continue tithing and giving of your money to the Lord, or whatever your system is? How about the type of entertainment that you go to? Do you look at a time of vacation as an opportunity to go to movies that you wouldn't go in Charlotte, or read the kind of things that you wouldn't read at home, or watch the time of television go by without any discipline, or do some of the things socially that you wouldn't do in Charlotte for whatever reason? Is it a time for you to escape from social, ethical, and spiritual guidelines that you would never adjust or adapt or lower if you were here in Charlotte with people who knew you? How do you live when no one's watching? How do you act when there aren't any Christians and no system to strengthen you as a believer? This is all in the back of my mind as I picture for you, devotionally, historically, and biographically, this young fella, Daniel. You say, but as a young man, he was in the lion's den. No, the artists are all wrong. Daniel was 80 years old when he was thrown into the lion's den. And some of the things that happened to Daniel later had their roots in the fact that as a young man, we all know the story. In chapter 1, he purposed in his heart not to defile himself with the king's meat. But before we get to some of those texts, let me just speak about this young man. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 4, and other passages, we learn that Daniel at 16 was an extraordinary young man. He was not only disciplined, he was not only good-looking and striking and promising. But everything about him suggested he is a winner. He was not put to death like the others. And what I want you to get tonight from the story of Daniel is very practical help, I think, about being a parent and being interested in child evangelism and the kind of things that we hope to continue to do and increase here at Calvary, that the way young people are trained in the early days is really more important than the kind of sermons they hear when they're in college. I suggest to you that when Daniel was 16 and given the option of taking the diet system and the sleeping habits and the regimen of the Babylonian system of training for young men, that he could excel at that point because for 16 years, his mother and father, we know absolutely nothing about them. And his home life, that we don't have a single clue into, was strong, steady, disciplined, and God-fearing. At the age of 16, he makes a spiritual commitment that makes him, as a teenager, a giant beyond all other young men in all of the Old Testament. At 16. You see, crisis and confrontation does never produce character, but it reveals character. How you hold up in a moment of stress is the greatest insight into your Christian experience than anything else. That would be the litmus test of the inside of your heart. I suggest that the reason why we glory in the discipline of Daniel at the age of 16 in Daniel chapter 1 is because his mother and father did some job in raising that boy. To think of him physically suggests, I think, and I'm going to be silly for a couple of minutes, that his mother said, "You're going to eat your vegetables." I suggest that silly little things that we as parents take for granted about the health and the well-being of our children, you factor all of that in and you let your mind wander as far as you wish. This young man looks the part, he'll act the part, his character will reveal the part that his parents plowed deep in this young man's life, because the moment the crisis comes, he stands the test and becomes superlative in every mark of godliness, every mark of being a man, even though he's a teenager, and every mark that says to God, and we'll see a couple of verses like this tonight, I can trust him to the very end. Now, I'd like you to look, please, in chapter 1 of Daniel and take a couple of notes tonight. It's my impression that Daniel is the counterpart of St. Paul in the New Testament. And I've listed just 6 things. First of all, he is a counterpart to Paul in the Old Testament because he is trained by the very best, and his childhood was one of great discipline. When St. Paul met the Lord Jesus on the road to Damascus, his background was rich and deep. We know he was a Hebrew of the Hebrews. As touching the law, he was blameless. Go, if you'd like to, for further Bible study as a footnote to Philippians chapter 3. Everything that produced Paul until he was converted was exactly what God was looking for in a man who could be the architect and the strategist for the Church of Jesus Christ. Secondly, Daniel is a prophet to the Gentile leaders, to kings, to those in authority. And unlike most of the prophets in the Old Testament, he becomes a messenger to Gentiles. Now, we know that Jonah was too, and likewise Jonah is a type of Jesus Christ. But Jonah was an evangelist with a general message. Daniel is a Hebrew prophet with a specific message that reveals the future salvation of Gentile peoples. And that's exactly what St. Paul was. The mystery of the dispensation of the truth to the Gentiles. Thirdly, we know that Daniel was very disciplined physically. And we know that St. Paul was, even though he wasn't, from what we understand, much to look at. But Paul makes statements like, I keep my body under, lest when I preach I become a castaway. And Paul speaks a lot about personal discipline in the Corinthian passage. It's better to marry than to burn, and phrases like that, which constantly give you the impression that Paul is aware of the dichotomy, the cleavage, the tension between body and spirit, the flesh and the spirit. And even though we assume that Paul had physical problems in terms of health and maybe eyesight and a couple other things, St. Paul was very, very disciplined. And so was Daniel. All through his life, he's disciplined. The third thing is that both Daniel and Paul excel and surpass all of their peers. Of Ezekiel and Jeremiah, Joel, Amos, and Obadiah, and all of the prophets, Daniel is by far excelling all the rest in terms of scholarship, in terms of leadership, and in terms of experience. He's an intellect. He's a writer. He can debate. He has great discernment. He has wisdom. He can articulate the Word of God. And in every aspect of his life, he's so much like, for instance, Amos, who says, I'm just nobody. I don't know why anybody took me. But if God wants me, I'll do it. And the other prophets are rather reluctant because of their inexperience. But not Daniel. And it's so wonderful to see in the service of God, in the service of Jesus Christ, men with multiple gifts who say, as Paul did, I don't think any can compare themselves to me in terms of my experience and my gifts. But he says, I count them all as really nothing, because I hope to convince you, not with the demonstration of words and with wisdom, but with the wind, the power, the demonstration of the Spirit of God. But when it came to St. Paul, there wasn't a single thing he couldn't do. And there wasn't a single thing he hadn't done. And he was willing to say, if anybody wants to match me, you come up. But I'm telling you, no one can surpass me. I've seen it all, and I've done it all. And as touching the law, nobody matches what I've excelled in terms of my religious experience. But I count it all as dung, that I may be found in him and know the fellowship of his sufferings and so on. And Daniel's like this. And so you have here a tremendous parallelism, a personal conviction. I've not read this anywhere. That Daniel and St. Paul are very, very close in so many, many capacities. And unlike all the other prophets in the Old Testament, Daniel has a singular ministry to kings. His whole ministry is to leadership, to those in authority. And you think of Paul, likewise, Agrippa, and all of the great leaders. He had been to them. He had debated with them, even those scholars. When he started as his starting point, the unknown God and so on, he could quote and dialogue with anyone. And he reached the elite. And Daniel is a minister, he's a prophet to the elite. Now I think that's enough on that. But I'd like you to see also, just for your own imagination, that like Moses, Daniel is a transplant. Daniel is a transplant. Unlike, of course, Moses, in that he had all of that experience of leading the people. But there's a sense in which he is transplanted into a situation that has everything in it that should dissolve his faith. And that's my starting point, and that really is my whole message to you tonight. How do you hold up when nobody supports you? How do you live for Christ when no one is there to help you? How do you deal with difficulty when you're in the dark? How do you handle a problem when you can't counsel with anyone? How do you excel in times of weakness? How do you properly share your faith when you have very little evidence to go by? That's all involved in the life of Daniel. I'd like to suggest three things in this light, and I'd like you to take these down, because this is something I think that you might be able to use all of your life. I want you to notice in the story of Daniel that success did not spoil him to egotism and pride. He becomes, from the age 16 for the next 69 years, he becomes the number one ruler of Babylon, not of Israel. It would be easy, I suppose, to rule Israel, we might say, but then we study the life of Moses and we know it was not easy. But he surpasses all else and becomes the number one person in authority next to the final ruler of this empire. But success doesn't spoil him. You know, you find very few people who are not spoiled by success. Somehow, when a person succeeds, his character begins to leak through the cracks. And success cannot be handled by very, very many people. And if something good happens, if something causes you to surpass or excel, it will become a very critical pressure on your character. He was successful, but in no way did it spoil him. He never becomes proud, and he never becomes egotistical. Secondly, Daniel is the illustration that achievement did not harden him to God. Achievement did not harden him to God. There was a sense in which the story of the people of Israel is that as they achieve, they become hardened. As God produces the miracle, they become more nonchalant. As He continues to deliver them, they become insensitive and impure in their worship. And so in the book of Jeremiah, we read God saying, through the prophet, stop your feasts, stop your prayers, stop worshiping me. You don't mean it. And there's a sense in which, when you achieve, you have a tendency to become nonchalant and hardened, particularly toward God. This is America. We have achieved, we are successful, but in the process we have become hardened to God. Not so with Daniel. The more he achieved, from 16 for 69 years, he became more sensitive, more open, and more of the vehicle of the revelation of God like no other prophet prophetically in all of the Old Testament. Third observation is that power did not corrupt him. Power did not corrupt him. Now remember, you're talking about Babylon. In the book of Revelation, there are more passages in the book of Revelation from the book of Daniel than any other book in the Old Testament. More quotations of the book of Daniel in the book of Revelation than any other Old Testament book. Remember that Babylon, and this will be somewhat strange to some of you, Babylon is the symbol for the total decadence of the world apart from the presence of Jesus Christ and the presence of the church in all of history. When you read Babylon in the book of Revelation, you are reading a word that describes the world in the final moments of its total corruptibility. Do you get my point? Babylon is the bottom line of mankind away from God. This is the culture in which Daniel lives. Not only violent and corrupt, but exceedingly gross to God. Not one single support system for 69 years, but he never was corrupted and always had his faith strong toward God. 69 years of pure living. You say he had some support. He had the 3 Hebrew children. First of all, they weren't children. They were governors of states. And we'll notice that even when Daniel could have stepped in and helped those 3 governors from going into the fiery furnace, Daniel never steps in and says, listen, I know those 3 fellas. They don't have to bow down. I can verify for them. He lets them stand up for their own convictions and get thrown into the furnace. And even though he's their boss and at the top level of management and execution of the policy of the state and foreign policy, he never says one word. And we'll learn a principle there in a couple of minutes. Daniel is an excellent example of what all of us should be. Success and achievement and power should not in any way spoil us, harden us, or corrupt us. And we have all of the support systems possible to make us strong in our faith, don't we? And yet some of us are as poor as a church mouse spiritually and as soft as could be imagined in the core of our spiritual discipline. Dare to be like Daniel, the song says. Now, I'd like you to take down a couple of things, and then we'll look at some beautiful verses. I would like you to take down 5 phrases, if you would. Write them in the column of your Bible. They're just something that I wrote. They're not out of any commentary, but it'll give you a handle on the book of Daniel. Just 5 simple statements, which you can apply to your life for the rest of your days. The first principle or guideline is this: when you are prepared, God will call you. When you are prepared, God will call you. I suggested to you early, Daniel was prepared by his family. He must have been, because of all the young men that were killed, he was spared. And of all the men, the young men at 16, they brought to Babylon, they said, Daniel's the best even of the best. I suggest at 16 he was prepared to hear God, to follow God, to obey God, to love God, to stand up for God at 16. We know he purposed in his heart at 16. Where did he get that? His family, his background, other Hebrew children had equal teaching by the rabbinical system, but Daniel took it seriously. And the principle of life is you get yourself spiritually prepared and God will use you. And if God's not using you, you're probably not prepared, and he knows it, in spite of what other people think. Prepared people are called people. Secondly, when you are called, God will test you. We learn that because the moment God begins to speak to Daniel, it looks as if the rug is pulled out from under him. And isn't that true? It seems the moment God starts to call you and reveal himself to you, bam, something happens. Why did this happen to me? To test you. Not to destroy you, but to further firm you up. Can you whistle in the dark? Can you go through the valley? Can you deal with difficulty? Can you handle the hassle? Can you cope with the criticism? Or are you just some seed that will be snatched away or pressured by the thorns and the other systems that seek to spoil the seed? When you are prepared, God will call you. When you are called, God will test you. Third principle. When you are tested, God will strengthen you. God will strengthen you when you're tested. He never makes you weak in testing. He makes you strong. My grace is sufficient for you. Therefore, it can be said, when I am weak, guess what? I'm strong. You see? The deeper the root, the more abundant is the fruit. The deeper of the decline of death to self, the stronger the life of the risen Lord and the believer. So when you are prepared, God will call you. When you are called, God will test you. And when you are tested, God will strengthen you. The third system, the third principle of this book for your life and Daniel's, my life tonight is, when you are strengthened, God will use you. When you are strengthened, God will use you. Jesus said that to Peter. The devil is going to throw you into a sieve, and he's going to sift you like wheat. If you go to Israel, you'll see them still doing it. They go in the field, and they pull all the wheat in, and they bang it. They bang it on a board. And when they bang it, all of the wheat drops out in a pile. And then it's always women. Men are not doing it. They're in the little villages gambling. You can see them. And sitting around with hot whatever. And they're playing cards. And then you go on the other side of Cana of Galilee and other little towns there. And you'll see the women. They're out in the field. And they have these big sieves. It's a board, a round board, like a 1x4, a board, and in the middle is some kind of a sieve. Most of them are kind of cloth. The ones we saw are cloth sieves, and they take all the stuff that another woman has banged away, all the wheat, the little pieces of wheat, and they put that stuff in this sieve, and the woman goes like this. And as she goes up with it, a little bit of breeze goes by, not too much, but enough to take what isn't wheat away. And you can see it fly off, and then the wheat drops in the little sieve that she has left, and then she comes over and dumps it in a pile. Then they make bread out of that stuff. And that's what Jesus was talking about. The devil has a sieve. He's going to throw you up in the air and going to bounce you around a little bit and put you to test. But, Peter, I prayed for you. You'll make it. And when I have prayed for you, guess what? You will strengthen the brethren. You see the principle? The principle's there. When you are strengthened, God will use you. He'll never use a weak vessel. Never. Be strong. God will use you, Israel. Be strong. As for me and my house, we're going to be strong. I don't care about you, but we're going to serve the Lord. When you are strengthened, then God will use you. Last of all, when you are used, God will reward you. God will reward you. Have you got it? And the text for that might be chapter 5 and verse 17, for instance. I'll go through them again. When you are prepared, God will call you. You have it? When you are called, God will test you. A verse on that might be 2:20. When you are tested, God will strengthen you. Chapter 3, verse 17, for instance. When you are strengthened, God will use you. Chapter 4, for instance. When you are used, God will reward you. All right? Any part of that which I gave that you did not get that you would like me to repeat? Put up your hand and I'll do it again. All right, okay. I just jotted down a few, Paul. When you are prepared, God will call you. Chapter 1, verses 1 to 21. When you are used, God will test you, beginning in chapter 2 and verse 20, for instance. When you are tested, God will strengthen you. Chapter 3. Mainly, I think, verse 17. When you are strengthened, God will use you. In chapter 4, just generally through there. The principle goes really through all of the book. And when you are used, God will reward you. I want you to go just for a minute or two, please, to chapter 3. Remember, we're looking at it devotionally. I'm not going to deal with the image of the various metals and things like that. That's looking at it prophetically, and we'll have prophecy later on when we get to Revelation. I just want to take this thing in terms of some personal observations. In chapter 3, of course, we have this great story of the image of gold. Now, this image is a symbol of selfhood of the king. The image is 90 feet tall. 90 feet tall. It's made of solid gold. And it's on a piece of real estate that doesn't have anything near it for 15 miles. 90 feet tall, not a single building within 15 miles. This thing sticks up like a Washington monument with nothing else that it can be compared with, or nothing that would distract from you seeing this image. This great statue of the king. Solid gold glistening in the sun. The command is given that everyone will come to this shrine of selfhood. The image, of course, and the model of the power of Babylon the Great. And everyone, when the music starts, will bow down and worship this image. And 3 men decide that they're not going to join this knee-bending society that everybody seems to be fond of. So when the music is played, everybody is down, and these 3 guys are sticking up like 3 sore thumbs. And the second opportunity is given that maybe they didn't hear the music, so they'll play the music again, so they make sure everybody goes along with this great adoration of the king and the empire of Babylon. And they, of course, do not do it. And you know the consequence. The fiery furnace, beginning in verse 16, 17, and 18. You know all about that one, I think. I want to make 3 observations about how you handle a challenge to your conviction. How do you handle a challenge to your conviction? It may be saying something at the office. It may be something within your family. It may be, I don't know what it is, but when your Christian experience, when your testimony, a conviction that you hold in relationship to your faith in God is challenged, and you have to surrender your conviction in order to compromise to keep peace, how do you deal with that? I put down, first of all, don't think twice when you're asked to act contrary to your convictions. Don't think twice when someone asks you to do something that is a contradiction to your conviction. If you hold a conviction, whatever it is, and it's your conviction, never compromise it. Don't adjust it or cause it to be assimilated by a peer group or a person. Never think twice about anything that compromises your conviction. Dear people, if you and I would set that as one of the key rules in our Christian experience, we would never have problems in the area of what should I do and what I am allowed to do, what I shouldn't do, and what I know I ought not to do. The second observation I have is, don't be willing to go along with that which the world says you ought to go along with, under the phrase, for instance, well, everybody is doing it, or, well, most people think. One of the problems in America is that we go by consensus thinking. Most doctors recommend. Well, if most doctors recommend it, how could you not want to buy it? The polls show that. Consensus thinking, even individual commercials that are sponsored by a particular company where a person says, and I've started to write an article on this for the evening paper, where the person says, for instance, a couple of things, I can't remember what they are now, but I took some notes last week on this, where the word trust and believe is used. Look for those two key words. Oh, I know. You can trust, they say, Tylenol. And the girl at the front of the commercial says, I found it worked for me. It only is a 20-second commercial. The first word of the commercial is, it works for her. Okay? You want something to work if you're going to buy it. If it doesn't work, you take it back. You can't take a pill back after you swallow it. So you want it to work. First of all, it's got to work. Okay? At the front of the commercial, she says, it worked for me. And the bottom line on the Tylenol commercial is, you can trust it. You see? They're very important words. It's got to work, and you can trust it. Now, if it works and you trust it, of course you're going to buy it. And since other things don't work and you can't trust them, then why do you fool with it? Buy Tylenol. That's a good commercial. And since everybody is saying it took away this boom, 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 you got one, so you want it to work. So you buy it. Consensus thinking. And this is consensus thinking. Everybody's going to bow. You shlemiel, which is a Hebrew slang on the streets of New York for you dummy. Duh, shlemiel. Shlemiel is a Jewish word that doesn't have any interpretation. But when you say in Jewish, you're a shlemiel, what it sounds like is what you are. And they're saying to these Hebrew shlemiels, hey dummy, the music has started. Play the music again, they will at this time bow. Everybody is. No, I'm sorry. We are not going to bow. We're not going to compromise our conviction just because everybody else is going to bow. That doesn't mean we have to, in spite of what the polls say. Okay? Third thing. Don't depend on anyone or anything to rescue you or to help you when your conviction is challenged. I say that and bring it back to my observation that Daniel doesn't help these three of his brothers. And as far as we know, these were the only friends he had for 69 years. There were only 3 believers in the life of Daniel: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel. There are only 4 believers in Babylon, as far as we know. And when his 3 comrades are ready to be shoveled into the furnace, Daniel doesn't come with an encyclical with his name and say, listen, if these fellows are going to go in, I'm going to go with them. He doesn't do that. And I suggest to you that if your conviction is strong, it doesn't make any difference what other people are going to say or what other people are doing. You ought to be able to stand on your own 2 feet. And these feet, we assume, are planted on the irrevocable promise of God. And you hold your convictions without compromise, even though it means your very life. Now that's easy to say, isn't it? And how any of us will fare in times of maybe physical persecution in the United States, I don't really know. And so my words tonight may come back as a boomerang someday if I am ever asked to compromise my faith at the threat of the slaying of my children or my wife or the taking away of my own. Who knows how any of us will stand at moments like that? All I know is that Daniel did. I know that Daniel did not compromise his conviction in the middle of corruption. This book is so helpful in terms of your Christian experience. It actually gives you goosebumps. And I suggest that you read the book of Daniel this way. So many are reading it prophetically in terms of the 69 weeks and the 7 weeks and the continuation of the Gentile period and the 70th week of Daniel and the book of Tribulation. All of that is good. But I hope tonight to have given you an insight into the life of this man who stands as a model and an example of how we can really deal with the challenge of our conviction in a somewhat corrupt world. I say somewhat compared to ancient Babylon.